Okay, so welcome to everyone who's joined us tonight. We've actually got a huge group, which is great. And I think we were talking about it earlier off air. I think the reason for that is it's quite an interesting topic. It's, conventional sports nutrition and strength and conditioning, but we're bringing it into an integrative or functional approach. And before I go any further, I'd just like to, if you haven't done already, just type in where are you dialing in from, what do you do, and what you'd like to learn tonight. And it will help us guide the presentation. The format of the presentation is the way I normally do it. Simone and I are going to interchange through a presentation. If you've got any good relevant questions for what we're talking about at the time, we'll look at that and bring them into the discussion. If they're more general questions, save them up and we'll do a Q&A section at the end. So Simone, you'll need to move slides. So next slide, please. So this is what we're going to cover. Simone's going to go through some conventional views of hypertrophy in sport. I'm going to then look at the body as more of a biological system when it comes to musculoskeletal health and adaptation. Simone's going to bring up this new topic that's in the literature called the gut-muscle axis. And then I'll talk about some interventions. And we're essentially sponsored by CISN to do this free webinar for you. So we're just going to give you a little couple of minute punt after that about the new October intake. And then we'll give you a Q&A time. So hopefully if we get our timing right, we'll have a good 15 minutes at the end. So I just want to introduce this topic by saying that we're kind of in a mechanical era of thinking about things. So especially when it comes to training, coaching methodologies, science is often quite a mechanical type approach. And it can be quite theoretical. So I see a lot of clients that will be coached by, a qualified coach and they're getting fairly off the shelf training protocols that's based on this mechanical model, this ideal person. But in reality, the person is a living, breathing organism that adapts to training differently from their training partner, their husband, their wife. There's genetic differences, and they're also subject to what they're experiencing day to day. So what's going on in their life. And when we think about it, even though we consider something like hypertrophy maybe quite mechanically, the human body or an animal's body is capable of this adaptation to grow muscle. Whereas a machine, which is thoroughly mechanical, can't. We don't grow the strength of our car by more trips to the shop, but we can actually adapt our human body. So we're going to go through, as I say, some conventional approaches and then go in a bit deeper to the systemic health that we need to be considering as practitioners working with people who are looking for more of a hypertrophy model. This is slightly out of my comfort zone because I'm more of an endurance person, but this is Simone's remit, and she's recently just done a full lecture on this topic for our course, the June intake of this course. So I thought it'd be quite topical for us to do a sort of back and forth and look at hypertrophy from this other perspective. So over to you, Simone.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm Simone and I'm the course coordinator. So I'm no expert when it comes to hypertrophy, but it is an area that I'm definitely really passionate about. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of hypertrophy from a conventional perspective. So let's look first at the mechanisms that produce the hypertrophic adaptations that we see. So first at the top, we have satellite cells. And these are basically myogenic stem cells, which are involved in skeletal muscle repair and regeneration. So when we injure ourselves or when we severely exercise a muscle fiber, what happens is satellite cells are activated, they will undergo cell division and give rise to new immature muscle cells. We then have hormones such as testosterone, growth hormone, as well as cytokines, myokines. So myokines are basically cytokines that are produced, released by the skeletal muscle, that can have both local and systemic effects. So one of the most well-known and well-researched ones is interleukin-6, and it has been significantly correlated with a degree of muscle hypertrophy after a single bout of resistance exercise. We then have muscle hypoxia, and that's a lot of the studies look at combining blood flow restriction to the muscle, and especially low load resistance exercise. We then have cell swelling, or what's commonly known as the muscle pump, and that's very common in bodybuilding type training. And then most importantly, the myogenic pathways, and we'll focus on mTOR, and it's considered the master regulator. And I wanted to focus on this because as nutrition practitioners, it is important to have an understanding of this pathway, because it is regulated by the energy status of the individual, but also certain amino acids, as well as mechanical stimuli. So when we load the muscle, what happens is that what is thought to happen is that the integrity cell is disrupted, and this is sensed by mechanosensors on the skeletal muscle fiber, and that can activate the myogenic pathways, and specifically the mTOR pathway. So mTOR, which stands for the mechanistic mammalian target of rapamycin complex, it forms the catalytic center of two signaling complexes. So you have mTOR-C1 and mTOR-C2, as we can see here in the figure. And mTOR-C1 is considered the primary one when it comes to regulating muscle protein synthesis. So mTOR-C1 is the protein complex, and it comprises of 3 core subunits. So we can see in the figure it's mTOR, MLST8, and Raptor. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, mTOR-C1 is regulated by several different inputs, such as dietary amino acids and mechanical load. And it's the activation of this mTOR-C1 that can lead to the phosphorylation of its 2 important sets of substrates downstream, which are involved in the translation of messenger RNA into protein. Now, muscle hypertrophy can be influenced by certain factors, and we can group them into 2 categories. So we have exogenous variables and endogenous variables. So your exogenous variables or factors are those that are related to resistance training. So for example, overall load, overall volume, the number of reps, time under tension, etc. Diet-related variables, so we have total energy intake, protein intake, etc. Supplements, there are some supplements that may aid muscle hypertrophy. It does depend on the individual though. And then the administration of exogenous anabolic hormones. Your endogenous variables are unique to the individual. So you've got your genomic, epigenetic, transcriptomic, and proteomic variables. And importantly, the endogenous variables can be affected by the exogenous variables, such as nutrition and resistance training. And this is where we see differential responses, and we can group people as low or high responders. So although the exogenous variables are important, it is becoming widely recognized that the endogenous variables are paramount in determining an individual's hypertrophic response to resistance training. Now, going specifically into nutrition and considering the energy needs, so you've got the 3 conditions: hypocaloric, eucaloric, and hypercaloric. So your hypocaloric is when your energy expenditure exceeds energy intake. And an energy deficit is known to be suboptimal for muscle growth. And this is because there is a downregulation of that mTOR-C1 pathway and the activation of the energy sensor AMPK. However, you can still increase lean mass when there is resistance training and high protein intake present. However, this effect is clearly diminished in trained lean individuals compared to someone who's untrained and carries more body fat or fat mass. And this is thought to be because these individuals have the endogenous stores to fuel the process of skeletal muscle hypertrophy. The eulocaloric conditions, it is more favorable for muscle hypertrophy, but only when protein intake is adequate. And then your hypercaloric condition, this is where we have an energy surplus, which is optimal for muscle hypertrophy. Now, looking specifically at the energy surplus, and specifically at the magnitude and nature of that energy surplus, it is important to distinguish between untrained and trained individuals. Now, Aragon and Schoenfeld, they argue that untrained individuals do have a larger potential to fulfill in muscle gains. So it is possible that lean and more advanced trainees are more prone to gaining fat mass. So when it comes to the magnitude of the energy surplus, untrained individuals, what is suggested is a 20 to 40% above maintenance caloric needs, whereas trained individuals is 10 to 20% above those maintenance caloric needs. In terms of the nature of the energy surplus, both groups should focus on protein, at least 20 to 40 grams per meal or 0.4 grams per kilogram body weight. But the untrained individuals, because they have a greater or higher energy surplus capacity, they benefit more from carbohydrates to fuel their training. Whereas the trained, more advanced trainees, because of the lower energy surplus capacity, they should really focus on protein to minimize fat mass gain. So to conclude, practitioners are advised to take a conservative approach when it comes to an energy surplus within the range of 350 to 500 to minimize those fat mass gains. But even more importantly, we should regularly review an individual's body composition and functional capacities like strength, so we can individualize and further personalize their dietary intake and see how they're responding to the training program, but as well as their nutrition. And then finally, we know that protein is important. It is paramount to focus on if skeletal muscle hypertrophy is the main goal. So there is a hierarchy. At the bottom of most importance, we have total protein intake, followed by protein type and quality, protein distribution and timing, and then supplementation with a question mark because it might not always be needed. And there are some individuals that don't always respond to certain supplements. So if we start at the bottom, one of the key studies was a systematic review and meta-analysis by Morton et al. And they try to identify what is the optimal amount of total protein intake. And they found it to be at around 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight per day. But again, science looks at the average, and we do need to take the individual into account. And it may be the case that certain individual might need more than 1.6. I've had clients who've had to go to 2 grams per kilogram body weight to try and maximize skeletal muscle hypertrophy. When it comes to protein type and quality, we know that leucine is a key driver for that mTOR C1 pathway. So it is important to focus on whole food sources as well as isolated protein sources that do have a high amount of leucine. However, we do know that athletes, so in trained conditions, the muscle is more sensitized, and it's thought that their leucine threshold is lower compared to someone who's untrained or sedentary or someone who's at bed rest conditions. So an athlete can get away with a bit less leucine, whereas an untrained person would have to either consume more leucine or load the muscle to get the same anabolic response. We must also recognize, though, that we can optimize protein quality of suboptimal sources. So if you're thinking about plant protein sources, by combining them. And looking at whole foods specifically, there is evidence to suggest that the micronutrient components of these whole food sources can enhance muscle protein synthesis and support muscle hypertrophy. When it comes to protein distribution and timing, it is important that an athlete focuses on an even distribution of protein throughout the day and don't eat most of their protein at dinner time, which is what we commonly see. And when it comes to timing, it does depend on the context, in the sense of it depends on what the athlete ate before their session. So if an athlete goes into a session in the fasted state, or they had their last meal 4 to 6 hours before their training session, it does make sense to prioritize something immediately after their resistance training session, or even during their session if it is a long resistance training session. But if they ate a high protein snack before their session, then they can afford to delay that post-exercise feeding by an extra hour or 2. Similarly, if an athlete has a big meal before their session, they can delay that post-exercise feeding even further. And this is because of that transient anabolic effect of the pre-exercise protein snack or meal. So there's still amino acids in the system. However, I don't think there's any harm into try and educate athletes when it comes to taking something on board after a training session. It is a good strategy and a good practice for some athletes to make sure that they are meeting their protein requirements as well as their overall energy needs. But in general, I would always recommend an athlete to consume a high protein meal within 2 hours of their post-exercise training, in the post-exercise period. And then finally, supplementation. So looking specifically at protein supplementation, they seem to be more effective in trained individuals when compared to untrained individuals. And it does become less effective with the increase in chronological age. But again, if an athlete is already meeting their 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight with whole foods, I would really question the efficacy of protein supplementation. But it is a convenient way for them to ensure that they're meeting their needs. Other supplements that are well researched and may support muscle hypertrophy are creatine and caffeine. But again, creatine, not everyone responds to it. And caffeine, we do need to be careful because some individuals are slow metabolizers and don't tolerate caffeine very well. So it's about personalizing to your individual athlete. Now on to Ian, who will present more of a biological view of musculoskeletal health.
Thanks, Simone. So that gives a bit of basis of standard views in sports nutrition with regard to hypertrophy. So energy needs, macronutrient needs, but of course we all know that we can go into the macros and the phytonutrients, and there's a lot of individual variability. So the thing I like to do is go into the physiology and just have a look and see what's there. So what I'm about to present is fairly basic, and it's nothing new to you guys, hopefully, but it's just a reminder of, let's just look under the bonnet occasionally and see what else we should be considering. Next slide, please. So this is just a Shutterstock image of connective tissue. There's 6 main connective tissues in the body. This picture only has 5. The 6th one is blood. So connective tissue is a base compound that basically connects our whole body. And if we go on to the next slide. Most of us have seen this kind of Russian doll picture. We go from the left-hand side where it's myofibrils into the whole muscle belly. And, you know, we're talking hypertrophy, we're talking musculoskeletal, well, we're talking about muscles. So what's that got to do with connective tissue? So it's very much a reminder from this image that connective tissue wraps all the way through from the tendons to the next tendons and ligaments wrapping the musculoskeletal system together. And if we go to the next slide. And this is one of the books that you'll have come across if you're in strength and conditioning or body work or whatever. And basically it's all about connective tissue. So here's one image of the nervous system. Next one. Your cardiovascular system. Next one. And then just one of the anatomy trains according to Thomas Myers in the body. So that's how we're kind of made up. If we go to the next slide, we're viewing a little bit deeper into the connective tissue under the microscope. So we've got these collagen fibers, we've got fibroblasts, and we've got elastin fibers. So we can look at any of these in detail, but I'm going to go a wee bit more into collagen, reminding us that collagen is a tissue that's like glue. In Greek, it's actually called glue. So it holds all of our connective tissue together. It holds our musculoskeletal system together. And yes, we need amino acids. So protein, glycine, and lysine are the bases of the helical structure of this collagen. But we also need vitamin C for cross-linking. So it's just a first little indication that we also need the micronutrients to hold things together. We also need to remind ourselves that every single muscle fiber is a muscle cell. And the muscle cells are very dense in mitochondria, obviously depending on how somebody trains. And they're susceptible to inflammatory damage. They're susceptible to oxidative stress. So every single aspect of our musculoskeletal system needs to be protected by what we're doing systemically. And I said the word systemically there. We can focus specifically on muscles, but what's happening in our whole body is affecting our muscles. And that's kind of a connection onto where we're going with the gut axis in a minute. And we need collagen. There's 5 different well-studied types of collagen. One of them is required for tendons and ligaments, as you might guess. But we also need other types for mucosal membranes. So something like hydrolyzed collagen now is quite a popular supplement, which could be used for recuperation purposes when you're doing weight training, or it could be used for repairing a leaky gut. So there's a bit of cross-linking and a systemic connection that I just want to bring to your attention there. Okay, next slide, someone. Okay, so what happens when we want to load these tissues in a scenario of heavy exercise or progressive exercise? Next slide. This is our old supercompensation models. Something I find nutritional therapists don't look at enough is training theory models. And people in coaching don't look maybe at the finer nutrition enough, but we can connect them. So this is your standard supercompensation model. You've got a base level, then you do like 5 sets of 10 squats with a particular load. That will result in a reduced capacity, which you could measure by a 1RM pre and post. And then there's a certain period of time before you hit, you strike through the baseline and then go into a supercompensation phase. Now, again, this is viewed quite mechanically, but we should be asking ourselves, okay, for me or for my athlete, for my client, what is their response? Because we've got the individuality around that. And how can we move this graph to the left? In other words, the supercompensation comes quicker after fewer days of recuperation. Next drop in. This is the kind of thing I see a lot in Joburg with my clients. They're just coming towards recovery and then they hit a hard training session again and then they keep going down, and over like a 2-year period, they're actually slower or weaker than they were before because they're constantly trying to overdo it. So this is basic but I like it just for that reason. We need to keep reminding ourselves. So let's bring it into a more physiological realm. So next slide. This is a paper I found by Peak et al. Apologies, you can't see this fully, guys, but you'll get the slides. We weren't quite able to figure out how to get rid of these boxes earlier, and Zoom occasionally does these little things. So basically, if you follow these keywords down the middle, you've got, this is an immune-based inflammatory response that cascades over several days. It starts with mopping up the debris that you've created by that, 5 sets of 10 squats. Then it pushes into a pro-inflammatory state, which after a certain amount of time is going to change into an anti-inflammatory state and gradually into a building and differentiation of new tissue, which is what we're looking for. If you go to the next slide, Simone. Oh, sorry, we've got a little thing here. If these, just a quote from the author, if these inflammatory responses are efficiently resolved, I can't read that word, sorry, something regenerating muscle fibers restore the ultrastructure of the skeletal muscle by around 7 days. 7 days, I hear you shout. Next slide, please. This is another graph from his paper, and unfortunately we can't see the side here, but we get strength adaptations. Ah, what happened there? That's better. So that's the kind of things that the authors were tracking, and what you can't see at the bottom now is the time period, but where my cursor is, or the last spots on the graph, are 5 days. So basically, yeah, they were saying it was taking 7 days to properly produce the inflammation, go into an anti-inflammatory state, and then build into a differentiation and a new modeling of tissue, which brings into mind, okay, what about all these CrossFit athletes who go 5 hard days in a row? How can they possibly be recovering? I'll just throw out here, though, that this is a research model. And what tends to happen is that you get people who maybe aren't habituated properly to the exercise. They're given a heavy exercise load, and it does take a while to adapt. In reality, we've got athletes who are habituated. They're not going to take so long, and they're not going to be hitting the same muscle groups every single day. And there's also huge personalization, as Simone referred to earlier. There's genetics. Some people never seem to get DOMs, lucky folks, whereas other people always seem to get DOMs and never quite seem to recover and build properly. But one group I want to just comment on, I know we've got a couple on the line tonight, and I've got good friends who are bodybuilders that I respect a lot. Intelligent bodybuilders seem to get this. They only hit one muscle group once or maybe twice a week, but they do it hard and they do it well, and then they recover well. So that's really important. But something I want to throw in there as well is we're not just looking at the local tissue. So yeah, okay, we've done a chest and tries session, and the chest and tries are quite burdened and inflamed, and it's going to take them a few days to properly recover. Some of that inflammation is going to become systemic as well. It doesn't just get stuck in your biceps. So if we can look a bit deeper systemically in general health, we can help that recovery process as well. So that's kind of where we're going with this. Okay, next slide, Simone. And I just want to throw out one slide before I hand back to Simone, which just paves the way for what she's about to say. This is a really old slide by Alex Vasquez, and it's on NF-kappa B, which is a nuclear transcription molecule for inflammation. And I think it's simple, and we know a lot more than this now, but I think it's bang on still. So you've got all these environmental stimuli down the left-hand side. It's a health model here, so you don't even see training mixed in now. But there's a lot of different things that will influence NF-kappa B expression, which then has all these cascades of inflammatory pathways happening, which can result in pain, inflammation, and health imbalances. So athletes are definitely not immune to health problems. And I've just highlighted the nutrient aspects on the left-hand side, but that's the bit as nutritionists we can go into more detail on. Okay, next slide. So when Simone started researching for her hypertrophy article, and lecture, and she shared this article with me on the gut muscle axis, I was very surprised but excited, because if you go to the next slide, Simone, we've been talking about this stuff forever, and ironically, the thing at the bottom's the bit we need to see here. Are you able to move that, Simone? No. So at the bottom, okay, there we go, that's better. At the bottom, we've got an inflamed knee. So basically, gut-brain axis, gut immune axis on the left-hand side, gut mitochondrial axis, and now the gut muscle or gut musculoskeletal axis. So I've been sort of lecturing around this, and it's common knowledge in functional medicine that inflammation in the gut will predispose you to inflammation at the musculoskeletal level. But the same comes back. You know, as I say, you can't just isolate the knee. You can't just isolate the biceps. It's a systemic picture. Okay, so I'm passing over to you, Simone.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the gut muscle axis. And we've all heard of the gut-brain axis. So that's the bidirectional signaling between our gut and our gut microbiome and the central nervous system. That mainly regulates stress-related responses as well as our mood. So for example, serotonin, we know that most of it's produced in the gut, and it's a really important neurotransmitter that regulates our mood as well as our sleep. But now there's this new axis that's emerging from research, and specifically research that looks at sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is the loss of muscle mass and function as we age. And that's the gut muscle axis. So this is it's the deep relationship between our gut microbiota and muscle function, as well as the metabolism within the skeletal muscle. Now, an athlete could be eating the most perfect diet that meets all their nutrient requirements, their energy needs, as well as their protein needs. But if they have poor gut health, this can compromise the process of nutrient absorption and extraction. And this will have downstream negative effects on the skeletal muscle. And this is where the muscle axis comes into play. Now, although there is evidence that athletes may have a more diverse gut microbiota than the general population, which is generally associated with better health and better metabolic function, we do know that athletes, especially if they are overtraining, under-recovering, they're also more prone to dysbiosis. So that's the imbalance between the good and bad bacteria, as well as an increased intestinal permeability. Now, while the research is still in its infancy, there is some indirect evidence that the composition of our gut bacteria can influence an athlete's anabolic drive and the subsequent muscle function. Now, I'm just going to talk about just a few possible pathophysiological mechanisms and negative effects that can occur because of dysbiosis and intestinal permeability. Now, first, what may happen is there might be compromised bioavailability of dietary amino acids. And again, we need those amino acids to activate the mTOR C1 pathway. So if we don't have, if you have the compromised bioavailability of these amino acids, this could translate into less muscle protein synthesis. Also, there might be reduced synthesis of certain vitamins like B12 and folate, And we know that these B vitamins are important cofactors within the Krebs cycle. So if we have compromised B vitamins, we will have compromised ATP production, which again can also affect the anabolic drive within the skeletal muscle. Now, the increased intestinal permeability, so this is where we have an impairment in that mucosal barrier. This can cause the absorption of byproducts that are produced by the gut bacteria, such as lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, as shown here in the figure at the bottom. And the increase of LPS has been shown to increase that inflammatory pathway that Ian mentioned, the NF-kappa B pathway, which is basically a family of transcription factors that regulate many important cellular behaviors. And with the increase of this pathway, it can lead to a decreased insulin sensitivity. It can increase catabolism and increase overall systemic inflammation. And then finally, there may also be a decreased biotransformation of polyphenols within the gut. So this will only lead to a reduced antioxidant capacity, which means that an athlete won't be able to neutralize the reactive oxidant species that are produced as a result from the exercise. Also, we can't forget stress. We know that training, specifically excessive training, is a stress on the body, but also other stresses in an athlete's life. And if they're constantly stressed, we're not allowing the parasympathetic system to do its function, which is to promote the gut motility and to promote the secretion of digestive enzymes. Also, our guts is really important because it does produce beneficial mediators. And I'll give you the example of the short chain fatty acids. So the short chain fatty acids, butyrate, acetate, and propionate, are the most well known. They represent as much as 95% of the short chain fatty acids. And these fatty acids are derived from dietary fiber. So they're produced by our gut bacteria. And not only are they important for maintaining gut integrity, because they're essentially a fuel for those intestinal cells, they also display various beneficial metabolic effects, such as promoting lipolysis, stimulating skeletal muscle glucose uptake, increasing insulin sensitivity, and modulating systemic inflammation. And all of these will influence an athlete's anabolic-catabolic balance. So I highly recommend that you read these two papers here at the bottom. I've got those references. You also have the references at the end. If you want to delve a bit deeper into the science and specifically look at the different species of bacteria. Now I'll pass on to Ian, who will talk a bit about some interventions that we can implement with our individual clients.
So thanks, Simone. That was a connection between gut health and musculoskeletal health and capability of adaptations. So I'm just going to give a few basic interventions that we use as nutritional therapists that I've pulled from my musculoskeletal lecture, which is musculoskeletal health. But you'll be able to see as we go through, each and every one of them can be used in gut health as well. So we can start having a systemic viewpoint of what we're intervening with. Okay, so next slide, Simone. And this is another really old slide, which I really like, from the IFM in the late 90s. And it's the arachidonic acid cascade, the eicosanoids. And down the left-hand side here, you're going to see a bunch of different nutrients and herbs, plant extracts that will decrease inflammatory response. Not a blocking thing like medications do, but they modulate inflammatory response. So you've got things like antioxidants, vitamin E and quercetin. You've got your omega-3 and omega-6. You've got ginger, turmeric, black willow, wintergreen. What else have we got? Boswellia, garlic, onion. So you get the picture. And even though it's a really old slide, you can jump onto PubMed right now and you'll be able to find linking of all of these with anti-inflammatory aspects in a systemic way. And if you want to look in a musculoskeletal level, you'll be able to find proof that ginger supports that. And you'll also be able to find evidence that ginger is supportive to gastrointestinal health. Next slide. So ginger is the first one that I kind of pulled out specifically for musculoskeletal health. And just press the next one, please. So this study, sorry, we're missing some words again. This study demonstrates that daily consumption of raw and heat-treated ginger resulted in a moderate to large reduction in muscle pain following exercise-induced muscle injury. So eccentric exercise is lengthening under load type exercise. So like doing an eccentric squat and then being assisted back up. So that's a common practice to try and induce, you know, breakdown of tissue, and it's well studied. So ginger can be helpful with that. Next slide. So can curcumin, or turmeric as we call it in cooking. Okay. This study suggests that the novel curcumin has the potential to help prevent muscle damage by regulating NF-kappa B and other pathways to improve the performance and nutritional aspects, something to do with inflammation. Okay, next one. And that was direct anti-inflammatory for the musculoskeletal system. Just two examples. They're my best two examples, plus using fish oils and omega-6 oils in good balance. But then quercetin has had a lot of research within exercise immunology. And here it's brought into context under muscular breakdown. So chronic quercetin supplementation has antioxidant potentials prior to and after strenuous eccentric exercise, thus making the erythrocytes capable to better cope with an oxidative insult. So, you know, this is a whole other realm. We could do another presentation on the antioxidant debate, you know, whether we should be supplementing antioxidants around heavy exercise. And there's pros and cons to that. But what I always come back to is, I think there's always a role for antioxidant-rich food. So I've just given you three examples there. Curcumin has a lot of antioxidant capabilities as well. And when there's inflammation, there's oxidative stress and vice versa. So they both help each other. Next slide, please. Other considerations that I would think of for specifically for musculoskeletal, proteolytic enzymes, and that's trying to decrease the debris as quickly as possible after breakdown of tissue. And I think, Simone, you found an article recently connecting it with hypertrophy as well, didn't you?
Yeah, did.
And then vitamin D, glucosamine, chondroitin, you know, a few other herbs that have got lots of you know, historical practice. And I'll just pick on MSM here. So that's organic sulfur. We've got a colleague, Heidi, in Cape Town, who is a specialist in sulfur. That's what fascinates her, the whole methylation sulfation pathways. And she says, in order to thoroughly nourish your gut lining, it has to be highly sulfated. And if you're not getting enough sulfur into the system, you're opening your gut lining to damage. So here's a product that gets used for joint health, but you can bring it into the gut. So that's just an example of this duality we can now set up. It's not just a particular pill for a particular ill. We're talking about the systemic nature of the body and what things have the biggest systemic effect. And I've obviously added in collagen, so we've got some good hydrolyzed collagens nowadays. You can bring that in for gut and musculoskeletal health. And then next slide. And then I've added a sort of personal slide, which is the way I work in practice. And I view the gut as a cascade that starts from the top and it finishes at the bottom. So when we're getting into the science of something like the gut muscle axis or the gut any other axis, the prevailing thoughts at the moment are, sorry, just one click, please. around the microbiome. The microbiome's the new passion and almost like fad. You know, the layperson knows about it. I did a podcast this morning on the microbiome for general population. So things like pre and probiotics, and obviously the food with good fiber that's supportive to your gut, and the specific microbiome testing as well now. Okay, next click. Membrane integrity. So these are well talked about in functional medicine, integrative medicine, and we're thankfully now seeing it in sports, sports nutrition, sports science. But we need to go up the cascade. So next click. This is where I start. Cephalic anticipation. That means the cephalic digestion is in your head. That's the aroma of garlic coming from an Italian kitchen, and you start salivating. Mindful eating, slowing down, activating your parasympathetic, use of digestive enzymes and betaine hydrochloride as required, lemon juice, apple cider vinegar. Next click. Food choices to decrease irritation of the gut and to increase repair. And, you know, the obvious ones are things like, you know, we can have big discussions around gluten and casein in the dairy and sugars and alcohols and caffeines and so on. It's not necessarily elimination, but we've actually had another webinar on that. But it's about looking at what's really going to repair that person's gut and give them a good gut rest so they feel better. Next click. And then if required, if you're a nutritional therapist, functional medicine practitioner, homeopath, naturopath, you might do certain more clinical strategies as well. And then the last click's right down at the bottom, which is elimination. So, you know, if the person's not pooing properly, all of those things above aren't going to work. But just a little tip, if you can get the top of the cascade flowing strongly enough, the bottom end is a lot easier to handle. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to give you a quick 1-minute plug on the course, and then we'll open for questions. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the course that we run is a 3-modular course that was live in London originally, but we've had massive adaptations to go through this year, and we've really streamlined the online process. And these are the prices. Modules 1, 2, and 3 is the certificate course, which is accredited. But this year we've also added in a cookery course from Rachel Jessen, who's a natural chef, qualified in Colorado. And these are the standard prices. But because a lot of people have struggled this year, we've, I was going to call it the COVID kindliness, but Simone talked me out of that because we're fed up of hearing the word COVID. So I've called it the 2020 Kindness Prize for the next 2 signups. We're basically looking for 2 more people to sign up to the October intake so that we have the numbers that we're looking for. So 30% off, plus we normally have a surcharge on monthly payments, so we're going to waive the surcharge. So you can basically do the sums there, or I can help you if you contact me. 30% off, almost a third off, plus no payment surcharges. So you can spread the payment. So just get in touch. I'm going to, when we open for Q&A, I'm going to drop the link into your chat box, because all you need to do is go into the Express Your Interest page on the website and just put in your details. Okay, guys, we've talked enough. So we're looking for some questions and good discussions.
Should I unshare the slides?
Yeah, you could do. That's fine. Okay, who's got something to say? can think about it as I'm typing.
Can I go ahead?
Go for it,
Amina. What would be what would be the strategies to do as we age to look after our microbiome, and so that we can benefit in this sense also for our musculoskeletal system?
Do you want to go, Simone?
I'll leave that one for you.
Okay, so I mean, it's more of a aging musculoskeletal health perspective. Have I understood that correctly?
More for the gut, right? For microbiome or specific to the muscle?
Aging musculoskeletal system, and how can some intervention with the microbiome, could that help with aging musculoskeletal system health as well? I don't know if there is anything on it.
I don't know if there's anything on it either. The question of aging does fascinate me, and I always come back to systemic health. So if we're going to have a healthy gut as we age, I think it gives our musculoskeletal system a natural head in the right direction. Because if we can, aspects of inflammation which are well connected, well established with chronic disease now, and the oxidative stress that goes along with that, and all the upregulations of oxidative stress that come with stressful life behaviors, that all blunts the aging process in a negative way. So if we can live in a way that we really, really focus on the nourishment of our gut, I think it's a great start, rather than like specifically trying to, you know, let's load in the glucosamine for my knee joint because my dad or my mom had osteoarthritis of the knees. Let's start with the gut. But it's a connection that so many people don't understand. It's the biggest area in our body that we can influence inflammation from. And it's where most of the immune system resides. And because inflammation is an immune response, then the best way to go is gut-based immunity in my mind. And I don't go to research papers for that. I go to personalized strategies with my clients and figuring out what works for them and what local sourcing of vegetables they can get, organic, you know, seasonal, all the basics I think are basic. And stress levels, you know, it's a massive killer. As Simone said earlier, you might get all the right food in place, but the stress in your life, you just are going to throw up that inflammatory response again. And so therefore, as I've evolved as a practitioner, I do so much more head work with my clients. And it's trying to nurture their journey slowly and gently, rather than giving them too specific a clinical protocol. So I haven't answered you directly from science perspective, but I have a strong sense and experience that you know, we just need to be gentle to the human body to get that positive aging.
I know Elizabeth just shared a nice paper on it, Amin. But also from a muscle perspective, we know as we age, we do tend to get more anabolic resistance. So our myogenic pathways tend to be less responsive to protein. So if we compare a younger individual and an older individual, to get the same anabolic response, an older individual would need to consume more protein or more leucine. You could supplement more leucine to get the same anabolic response. That's specific to muscle though. I know Paul he knows more about this than me, so he's happy to share more about it. He just shared his email.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Paul, do you want to jump in there at all? Can I just add a comment with what Simone just said? You know, we've got the thinking of the macros, and yes, as we get older, we need to be more vigilant around protein intake to avoid sarcopenia. But there's a potential there to shift the acid-alkaline kind of balance, or the plant-animal balance in our body. There's lots of different balances, pro-inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory potential foods, acid-alkaline. You need those vegetables. It's fundamental in my mind. I'm not a plant-based person. I'm not a keto person. I'm a kind of realistic, kind to people person. And that's how I see it. You need that balance. So yes, be more vigilant with the protein intakes and the timings around the exercise sessions as you get older, because anabolism is going to be harder, but make sure you get these balancers of the antioxidants and the anti-inflammatories into the body at the same time.
Omega-3s also tend to be, has been shown to help with the anabolic drive in older individuals in terms of muscle protein synthesis. So again, yeah, fish oils might be a good strategy as well, if muscle growth is the goal. Yeah.
I wonder where the mechanism is there in terms of, is it dampening down inflammation and then allowing what you demonstrated there in the gut muscle axis to happen more naturally?
I would need to research that, but I can get back to you, I mean, if you want the mechanism. I think it just sensitizes, I'm not sure, but it must be sensitizing some of the myogenic pathways, or mTOR specifically.
We have to keep in mind that we also have less growth hormone. That's perhaps one of the reasons why we have less anabolic drive, probably. Even we do the exercise, we won't be able to rise it as much as in a young person, I think, the growth hormone.
It also comes back to why do we have less growth hormone with age. So, a lot of it's aging is, yes, we're going to age, but there's also shifting behaviors as we age that increase the threat on the hormonal equilibrium, I should say. Okay, so Pete's saying mTOR is an again pathway. Did you mistype that? Do you want to jump in, Pete? And then I'm going to go to, is it Bouquet? I'll come to you in a sec. Pete?
Yeah, it's a balance, I guess, Pete.
So we've obviously been in this area for quite a long time now, and there's a big discussion about mTOR. Of course, mTOR is an aging pathway. So we're very clear on the evidence that if you're stimulating mTOR all the time, you're probably not going to live as long as if you weren't stimulating it. So there's a fine balance, and a lot of the researchers who look at fasting and restrictive diets are always saying one of the key reasons why we do that is that we restrict mTOR and stimulate AMPK pathways, AMPK pathways, which of course is a pathway that's an anti-aging pathway. It's relating to all the sirtuin genes, and we bring them up to expression. So there's a very fine balance with regards to where we're at, how much do we express and how much we don't. There's some key practical aspects of this that we've worked with many of our patients for years, and that is the reality of the patients that we see is that they are just not fit enough for purpose. They are already under-muscled, more likely to be moving towards sarcopenic states. And so therefore the balance for us is that regardless of whether we're going to be stimulating mTOR consistently, we've got to get these people to a point where they've got enough muscle mass that they actually don't die early, because either they're going to fall or life gets very restricted because they're just not physically capable enough. So there's a very fine balance with regards to mTOR. So for me, my situation, when we get patients in who are clearly sarcopenic and we've done the DEXA scans and they're very under-muscled, and we've got to do something about it. Because again, if we're looking at how do we define risk for aging and how long you're going to survive, when we're looking at what are the measures you could do, telomere testing, which probably is not as good as what we thought it would be. There's a new one, glycanage. But there was a paper that came out of PLOS in 2017, 2018, I always look to. And what it's basically saying is that the fundamental parameters of physical activity, physical strength, and importantly, having the flexibility and the stability are some of the key markers of aging. So for me, it's really important that when we're looking at fundamentally muscle mass for me, with most of the population groups that we deal with, and they are sedentary population groups, is absolutely key for making them age in an appropriate manner. The other thing to think about is that lack of exercise is pro-inflammatory. So you're in a situation where we need to get people to move and move daily, consistently, with light to moderate intensity, because it's anti-inflammatory by how it works. And most of that body is designed for movement. So a lot of your genes just can't work correctly because movement or forces are not being applied to them. And this is very consistent when you look at the astronautical research. So if you really want to look at what happens to a body when there's not forces applied to it, then you only have to look at the astronaut studies, and you look at systemically. So not only do you see osteopenia, osteoporosis happening very quickly, you'll see bone almost sarcopenic states, but also you'll see the systemic effect of what happens when you're not applying force to humans. And it's pretty profound. So for me, there's a huge balance. We don't clearly know. There are certain ways that we can say, well, mTOR stimulates aging pathways. And I had a very good discussion with one of my Twitter pals, which is Stu Phillips at McMaster. He's probably the world leader on protein. And the discussion was, if we take more protein, are we going to live longer? And we're taking more protein and working out consistently. He thinks we might lose a few years, but we'd be buffed while we did it. So again, I think there's a balance, and I think there's an individual process to what you look at. For me, if someone is under-muscled, it's trouble both metabolically, both musculoskeletally, going forward. And you've got to bring them up to be what I would consider fit for purpose for their age and where they are in their life, because otherwise you're going to run into a whole host of problems. So, and Simone's dead right. If the older we get, the way our body signals and does things just isn't as good. So we do have this anabolic resistance. We're pretty clear that in aging population groups, you've got to give them a bit more. You have to be giving them a bit more protein. And we've had patients in our 70s where we've been really challenged by that. And we found that actually protein drinks usually are actually a reasonably good way to do that, as long as it tastes good. So I don't know whether that added anything into the conversation. I think no one quite knows is the point, and we can make decisions with regards to, well, this is an aging pathway, and this is, an anti-aging pathway, and if you only do this, you're going to live longer. But the reality is, it's got to be applied in the context with the patient. So I want to stimulate mTOR with people who that don't have enough muscle mass. I want to drive it, but I know I'm driving it for a period of time because it's going to do a job for me for that patient so that they can go forward in the appropriate way.
Thanks, Pete.
No worries.
And I promised Pete a beer sometime, so he'll jump in and just add to discussion. And he brings nice balanced arguments like that. So that's a really, really key point about the mTOR. Everything's a balance in life and in the body. So let's not get excited about today's scientific discoveries because tomorrow you might have something else coming along. Okay, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Bouquet or Bouquet, do you want to come on and ask a question?
Yeah, it's Bouquet. It's like bouquet flowers. It may be for you. I actually have two questions for you. One of them is about using this antioxidants. Like curcumin or other stuff. There is a debate going on if using antioxidants are shadowing the training adaptations, especially in endurance training, because the reactive oxygen species are needed for PGC1 alpha to stimulate and all that cascade. So there is a debate if we shouldn't use antioxidants and leave just the food approach. And what is it with mTOR? Can we say the same with mTOR? Because we also know the antioxidants are effective on reactive oxygen species, but in a way they are needed for the body to adapt. What about, I don't know if I missed that part because for a while my internet went off. I hope I'm not asking that is already told. I just wonder what is the situation with muscle gain. And my second question is regarding to the teenagers, because I'm also working with the elite athletes, but we also have 5 young teams and from age 12 to 18. And the basic issue, especially when the age is around 14 and 15, oh, I want to gain muscle. My coach told me to be more muscular. And for some, if the maturation is delayed, I'm trying to explain them in a physiologic way. It's you have to wait for that. But what should be an ideal approach for them, because they're so prone to using something? I'm there to prevent them. Food first approach. But is there any advices that you can give here regarding to the teenage athletes? Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is I'll have a go at your antioxidant question. Simone, can you talk about the mTOR aspect of that? You okay with that?
I wasn't really clear what you meant on the antioxidants and mTOR.
So I'll answer the antioxidant and then we'll ask you again just to repeat that bit of it. And then we can both chip into the, the teenagers. So the antioxidant thing, it's been around for probably 20 years almost, with regard to one researcher says, okay, if we throw in lots of vitamin C, they recover from exercise quicker. Another one says, no, it actually stunts the supercompensation response. So if you remember that supercompensation curve, that's really key. So what we need to remember is we don't want to get too academic about it because these are laboratory-based assessments, and sometimes the same question comes out differently from different labs. We need to step back to the physiology of it. The physiology of it is we have antioxidant systems, glutathione system, catalase, superoxide dismutase. We've got all the nutrients that are required to nourish them. And then we've got the whole flora of food-based antioxidants. And for a while, early in the century, we're over-focused on like vitamin C, vitamin E, CoQ10, things you could capsulate. Now we've done a lot more in quercetin. 2008, I think, we started looking at beetroot juice, and then there's cherry extracts. And then I did a presentation in the course on sports drinks, and there are so many different antioxidant-rich juices that you could make out of different vegetables and fruits that can nourish the body. So on one case, if we took all antioxidants out and we had a very macronutrient-based diet with bread and protein drinks and some fats just to support the macros, but absolutely no color in sight, that person's not going to thrive. They're almost going to dry up and wither, and they won't recover from exercise. On the other hand, you've got somebody who's like, they've heard vitamin C is good and vitamin E is good, and they're taking every supplement they can get their hands on, and sometimes in high doses. Neither of those scenarios is the best. I always come food-based first, and Hannah Moyer is the lecturer at Kingston University who lectures on this topic in our course. and she does a very good balanced job. She'll go through the research and look at the different aspects like quercetin, and they've researched dark chocolate and the antioxidant levels. So yes, they're quite happy, or she's quite happy to say, high dose vitamin C, we need to be a wee bit cautious around that. Although there are proponents, well-known proponents of high dose vitamin C, specifically to elite athletes trying to get the best gain, yes, you need that hormetic kind of response. You need to stress the system. And if you try and throw in too many antioxidants, you can also say too many anti-inflammatories as well, you can stun that response. But my approach is to, well, let's make my own sports drinks out of a good quality fruit juice or vegetable juice. Let's have a really nourished meal plan, well, not meal plan, just, you know, a good nourishing diet with local, organic, seasonal. I spoke to my mum in Scotland the other night who'd been collecting brambles, which are blackberries. You know, wild brambles are super high in antioxidants. You're never going to convince me that it's bad for an athlete to scuff some wild brambles straight after the training session, because it's nature made. So you can take that a little bit further and say, well, what about these extracts? So something I make a lot of use out of is red powders. So it can be like berry extracts that have just been dried and powdered, and you take a little scoop and you put it in your smoothie or in a shake after a workout, or just generally through the day. So that's my approach on the antioxidant debate, although there is a lot of academic debate around that. But just, you know, if you can come back to food, you can be reasonably safe on that. If you can just unmute yourself again, Bukit, and ask Simone about the mTOR specific aspect.
It's like you told us that there is an inflammatory process going on, and that also affects mTOR, if I get it right, for the muscle stimulation, muscle fibers to increase. There should be an inflammatory reaction there. So if we give, for example, antioxidants, will that affect that path too in a negative way?
I mean, high dose antioxidants.
Yeah, mega, for example, 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, because right now in COVID-19 era, everybody is taking vitamin C, zinc, everything, like you know, M&Ms. So will that also affect that? If, for example, the person thinks that he or she is supplementing, is trying to boost their immune system, you know, there are lots of mediatic stuff going around. Well, but he's also an athlete who's trying to build muscle. Will that affect the mTOR cascade or stimulation? Is there any effect there?
I'm not sure. I would need to research that. I don't know if, Pete, do you know anything about that?
I'll just chip in that it's going to come back to balance. Yeah. You know, if you overdo it, just like to trigger mTOR, you'll need a certain degree of inflammation, like we've both presented tonight. But if it's over-inflammatory, then you can inhibit mTOR. It's going to be the same with antioxidant, you know, overstimulation. You need to get that balance right. Pete, anything to add there?
I'm not aware of any research that does. I mean, there might be, but you know, I suppose what you're looking at, I suppose, brings back to the question: is it by taking antioxidants you are reducing the oxidative burst and the inflammation that you need to drive that adaptation? I don't know is the answer to that. Maybe.
Thank you.
But I don't think it would be a major component of, I think it would probably be pretty minor if it was. And I don't actually know whether antioxidants have a direct anti-inflammatory effect on mTOR signaling as well. I think, as you say, the key is enough force to cause a load of damage, good inflammatory response, and then decent whack of protein are probably going to be your 1, 2s, and 3s. I think they're probably going to be peripheral to stopping that. That would be my thoughts.
I think in this day and age, there's enough to warrant a certain degree of antioxidant supplementation, because we don't live in organic farms now, and we have polluted lives, and we have genomic individual requirements. So we do need to, in my mind, supplement to a certain degree. Just how much, that's the big question mark. So I always, with that question, just stay a wee bit safe and kind of food-based supplementation, but there'll be situations where you need to rev up the antioxidants a bit more.
I think in this case, this is where testing matters, because then you're starting to get a really good indication of, hang on, this doesn't make sense. Here's a guy who's getting all the best foods that we would consider, but we're seeing just incredibly high needs, or we're seeing evidence of damage of oxidative stress. Now, I think some of the things you've got to consider is that, well, you know, there's going to be a huge difference between, let's just say you've got 2 marathon runners of, you know, the same ability, and yet one trains in a polluted city and one trains in the countryside where there's no pollution. So you got to think about the peripheral side. And for that, it would be like, okay, well, it makes sense then that if there's going to be anyone that I would supplement, I would be supplementing the marathon runner who's got to do his training in a much more polluted city. So again, the broader picture of, well, why would I need to supplement? I think probably, again, some things we've got to think about.
Yeah. Personalized medicine. And to finish on your teenagers, yeah, that's your power of persuasion as a coach. Food first, you know, you need to get the basics first. And I use some basic words like quality. Okay, you know, how good quality is their food? If they're eating rubbish, if they're supplementing with creatine, how much help is it going to be? It might help a little bit, but get the foundation right, get the pyramid foundation right, and then you can start building on what I call these as performance aspects. So creatine or even protein powder is a performance aspect in an athletic realm. Get the basic day-to-day diet, very nourishing for their health. And then, okay, right, let's talk about protein requirements. Let's talk about creatine, but also good quality, because, you know, so many products are laced with sweeteners, flavors, colorants. And just like Peter just said about, if you're in a polluted city, your body's going to have to work harder and use more oxidative antioxidants to clear them out. But you know, the same is if you got all these artificial things in your food. So I say clean, you know, buy the unflavored whey or pea protein or hemp protein, buy the white powder creatine, but then mix it up with some freshly made homemade DIY juice. And then you've got the antioxidant balance with those nutrients coming in. So have we answered your question? Okay.
Yeah, this is pretty much what we're trying to do, but I'm more curious about Simone's how much mTOR affects young people when they train when do resistance training. I mean, is there, for example, at the age of 16, it is still effective at like adulthood, or what happens with young people?
Good question.
Because sorry to interrupt, because when I advise to an athlete, I always mention that it's not just food. You have to do the resistance training. It's the balance, because things are happening there. And are those things happening the same with the young ones?
I think like they're obviously still growing. I wouldn't be able to give you like exact numbers and differences, but yes, I think you're right. Resistance training is the most important factor when it comes to muscle growth and muscle maintenance, and nutrition to support. So yeah, I'll say I'm same opinion as Ian. Focus on the food first approach, quality. Supplements, I would argue not even to bring them in until they later teens. So yeah, education is very important at that age specifically. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to say specifically the differences between young and adulthood. But it's a good question, and I can do a bit of research and maybe get back to you on that.
That will be great. Thank you.
Another way to think about that question is, where are they on the scale of elitism within their sport?
Yeah.
So yeah, they might be the best 16-year-olds in the country, but ultimately, are they wanting to be the best athletes in the country? And then they've still got a few years to go. So you need to tie their long distance journey that they're traveling, and not get too excited about being the best 16-year-old. Yes, there's a flavor there, but coach them longer term. So they need health practices to be able to last that long. And that's something that I see in 16-year-olds too often, is ones that have already push, and by age 18, they're out. So yeah, if you're loading too much specialized strategies, it's maybe too early. You know, save that, work on the basics. And if they're still good when they're 20, 22, well, you don't start creatine at that point, but you know, you get more specialized with getting it right. And that's when you can start reading up all the research papers by specialized creatine researchers who have got some nice protocols that you can put into action.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, guys, so that's
May
been
I
quite a
ask
lot.
Ian, sorry.
Oh, sorry, on you go. Right, Claire, hi.
Hi, I was just wondering, with athletes that travel a lot and food necessarily isn't an option in some parts of the world, well, obviously food's always an option, but good food isn't always an option. Yeah. With supplementation and being informed sport approved supplements, do you have a top 5 rundown of your best informed sport products?
Sorry.
On you go. You do the supplements and then I'll do the other bits.
So are you looking for like brands? Or type?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I've kind of resorted to Healthspan because that's kind of a trusted tennis brand. But if you look at the content of them, it's really poor. And a lot of the, I mean, you can get things like protein powders that are reasonable and informed sport tested. BioCare do a multi that's informed sport tested, some batch numbers, not all of them. But really, to get any decent supplementation without all the excipients and the flavors and all the sweeteners and whey isolate that you don't know where it's come from, I'm really struggling to find, you know, I end up with them on about 16 different products to take away with them, just so that they can maintain their nutrition whilst they're away from the UK or the US, and it's quite tough. So
yeah, I tend to go for Healthspan as well if it is for an athlete that is going to be tested.
Yeah.
Because Healthspan is, like, I think it's the only one that I could find that does an unflavored whey and an unflavored plant complex protein powder. Yeah. But yeah, the ingredients, not the best, but it's the only thing that we can do really.
Yeah, it's such a shame. I know that 4-5 CBD I know that Elizabeth's on the call as well. 4,5-CBD, they've got the BSCG testing, so that at least gives some support when you're recommending them to an athlete, plus a lot of their kind of marketing and testimonials support that too. So from that point of view, I guess there's another one we can add to our toolkit, but there's really not much out there, and it's quite shocking.
There are some brands, but in America,
yeah,
but it's trying to get them over to the UK. That's a problem, and they so I always go for HealthSpan.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I think we're in an era of waiting for more good companies to get on the informed sport. Like the stuff I use is not informed sport, but I don't often deal with drug tested athletes, so it's not really been a problem. So I'll just use the best that I can get. But in time, there needs to be more product companies going through that channel to work on, like if I had an adrenally fatigued athlete, there'd be nothing I could use if they're drug tested, but they still need the help. So yeah, as Elizabeth says, watch this space for a new wellness project coming soon. So cool, right? We'll hear from Elizabeth in due course. So thanks, guys. I think we'll wrap it up now. It's been I think the longest ever we've done. So it's been a good topic, and we've had some really good questions, really good discussions, and really good contributions. So thanks a lot, and look out for our next one. We'll announce each webinar a few weeks ahead of time. So thanks, and good night.
Thanks, guys.